There's a 15-second shot in the new Avengers Doomsday special look that tells you almost everything about why this villain doesn't work the way the last one did, and it's not the scene you'd expect. Thor charges in, full aggression, Stormbreaker raised, same posture, same fury he used against Thanos in Infinity War. And Doom stops it with 2 fingers, no strain on his face, no flicker of effort, nothing. If you've spent any time comparing power levels in this franchise, your instinct is to read that as a strength flex, proof Doom hits harder. That's the boring read. The actual answer is stranger, and it's got almost nothing to do with how hard either of them can punch. Go back to that Infinity War moment for a second, because Marvel is clearly inviting the comparison on purpose. Thor's charge at Thanos wasn't calm. It was desperate, grief-soaked, loaded with a weapon forged specifically to kill a god. And it worked, at least partially. Thanos staggered. He bled. He needed every Infinity Stone active at once just to walk away from that hit standing upright. That's the version of an unstoppable villain this franchise has trained you to expect. Something you can still wound if you throw everything you have at it. Now watch Doom's version of that exact scene again. Same aggressive charge, same god-tier weapon. And Doom doesn't even bother looking like he's trying. That's not a stronger villain doing the same thing better. That's a completely different category of threat being introduced through body language alone, and if Marvel built this parallel deliberately, and the framing genuinely suggests they did, they're telling you something crucial before Doom's ever said a full sentence on screen. Whatever Thanos was, Doom isn't a bigger version of it. He's not the same kind of problem at all. So let's actually ask the question nobody's framing correctly. Why does Doom feel different? And why should that difference worry you more than raw power ever could? Start with what actually made Thanos dangerous, because it's worth being precise about it instead of just calling him strong. The MCU's Thanos wasn't only a physical threat. He was a conviction wrapped in a body that happened to be nearly unkillable. He genuinely believed he was making the hardest, most painful sacrifice imaginable for a greater good, and that belief tormented him. He wept after the snap. He isolated himself afterward, growing vegetables, trying to live with what he'd done. Even his relationship with Gamora was built around that same tortured logic. He genuinely believed raising her the way he did was an act of love disguised as cruelty. And the fact that he needed to believe, that tells you everything about how much his own conscience was still operating underneath the armor plating. That internal conflict is exactly what gave the Avengers something to work with. You can argue with a man who's in pain about his own choices. You can find the crack in a philosophy that costs its believer something. Every hero who ever challenged Thanos, verbally or physically, was pushing against a doubt that was already there, whether he'd admit it or not. Doom doesn't have that doubt. That's the entire point. If you've been rewatching every frame of this trailer as closely as we have, looking for exactly this kind of tell, that's precisely the itch this channel exists to scratch, so go ahead and subscribe, because the deeper we get into this, the stranger Doom's psychology actually looks. Here's where the comics matter, because Marvel Studios has been extremely deliberate about which version of Doom's mythology it's pulling from, and the psychology behind that choice is the real story. In the comics, Victor Von Doom has never needed a justification for what he does, and that's not a throwaway detail, it's foundational to who he is. He doesn't see ruling the world as an evil plan he's talked himself into. He sees it as a responsibility that only he is qualified to carry, because in his own mind, he's already superior, already correct, already the most capable person in any room he's ever occupied. Thanos needed an ideology to survive his own actions. Doom's ideology is simply that he's right, permanently, without needing to prove it to anyone, including himself. That's a subtle difference on paper and an enormous one in practice, because it means Doom was never available to be persuaded in the first place. There was no internal argument to win. He'd already had it decades ago, and he won it against himself instantly. That mindset becomes genuinely frightening once you connect it to what Doom is actually capable of, because unlike Thanos, his power was never contained to one category. Victor Von Doom sits among the most brilliant minds in the entire Marvel universe, operating at a level that rivals, and at points surpasses, Tony Stark and Reed Richards. Through technology alone, he can build armor that would put Iron Man's earliest suits to shame. But his armor was never purely mechanical. It's enhanced by magic layered directly into the tech itself, and that fusion is what actually makes him unique inside this franchise. The M.C.U. has given us tech-based heroes and magic-based heroes as two separate lanes for over a decade. Doom collapses both lanes into a single character, and in the comics, that exact combination is what eventually pushes him past the ceiling every other villain in this universe has been operating under. It's worth understanding where that certainty actually comes from, because it isn't arrogance built out of nothing. In the comics, Victor grew up in genuine poverty, watching his mother's death and his father's desperation shape a childhood built entirely around proving he was better than the circumstances trying to define him. He was a prodigy at Empire State University, a rival, sometimes a friend, to a young Reed Richards, and the disfigurement that eventually forces him behind a mask comes from an experiment Reed warned him against. One Victor ran anyway because he refused to accept that anyone, even someone as brilliant as Reed, might actually be right about something he'd already decided. That single refusal to ever admit fallibility is the exact same trait now driving a man who believes he's earned the right to rule reality itself. Thanos' ideology grew out of watching Titan collapse under the weight of its own population, an external tragedy he internalized into a mission. Doom's certainty grew out of never once being able to accept that he could be wrong about anything. And that's a far harder kind of conviction to ever talk someone out of. There's one comic storyline worth walking through carefully here, because it's clearly the mythology Marvel Studios is building toward, even if the timeline for actually adapting it hasn't been confirmed. During the Secret Wars comic event, Doom absorbs the power of a cosmic entity called the Beyonder and becomes what fans call God Emperor Doom. That version of the character doesn't just win a fight, he destroys the entire multiverse and rebuilds it exactly according to his own will. He's not managing a kingdom at that point. He's rewriting reality itself, and in that specific state, comics depict Doom facing off against Thanos and ending the fight in roughly one motion, grabbing him by the throat and finishing it before Thanos gets the chance to do anything at all. That's worth sitting with, because it's not a fluke moment of Doom getting lucky. It's a demonstration of what happens once Doom stops being a very powerful person and becomes something closer to an architect standing outside the rules everyone else is still playing by. Whether the MCU version of Doom is anywhere near that scale right now is genuinely unclear, and it's important to be honest about that. But Marvel's own pattern, gradually escalating Doom across Doomsday and towards Secret Wars, strongly suggests they're building him in exactly that direction, and if that comic beat is even loosely the blueprint, it reframes everything about what this next saga is actually threatening to do. Go back to that Thor scene one more time with all of this in mind, because there's a detail worth separating from pure spectacle. In Infinity War, Thanos fought Thor and got hurt doing it. Effort was visible. Cost was visible. In the Doomsday footage, Doom doesn't appear to be spending any real effort at all, and there's a specific comic-accurate power some versions of Doom possess worth mentioning here as a genuine possibility. Not a confirmed detail, the ability to absorb an opponent's own power output mid-fight. It's entirely possible that single, casual block wasn't just defense. It might have been Doom quietly taking something from Thor in the process, which would mean the version of Doom we're watching, stop a god-forged weapon with 2 fingers, still isn't operating anywhere near what he's actually capable of. If that's accurate, the real question isn't how strong Doom looked in that shot. It's what he looks like the moment he actually decides to try. Now here's where the two villains' philosophies actually diverge in a way that matters more than any power comparison, and it's the part most breakdowns skip completely. Thanos' ideology, twisted as it was, still had an internal logic you could argue against on its own terms. Scarcity, sacrifice, balance, painful ideas, but ideas a hero could engage with directly, push back on, expose the contradictions in. Half the Avengers' plan across 2 entire films essentially amounted to proving Thanos' math was wrong, that scarcity wasn't inevitable, that his sacrifice solved nothing structural at all. That engagement is what eventually gave the Avengers their opening. Doom offers no equivalent opening, because his worldview was never built to be debated. He doesn't think the world needs saving through sacrifice. He thinks it needs correcting through control, and he's already decided he's the only one capable of doing it properly. There's no philosophical wound to press on, because there's no doubt underneath it to begin with. You can't talk someone out of a belief they never had to argue themselves into holding. That kind of certainty has a name in psychology, a genuine superiority complex, the quiet conviction that you're simply better than everyone around you. And it's worth noting that pattern shows up in other fictional geniuses built the same way. Brilliant, controlled, completely unbothered by the idea that anyone might actually be right to oppose them. Doom isn't unstable the way that makes him unpredictable. He's stable in exactly the way that makes him unreachable, and from a pure storytelling standpoint. That's an enormous risk for Marvel to take on purpose. A villain audiences can argue with is inherently easier to write satisfying confrontations for, because the hero gets something to actually push against. A villain who's simply permanently correct in his own mind removes that entire toolkit. If Marvel commits fully to that version of Doom instead of softening him with a redemptive doubt somewhere in the 3rd act, it's a genuinely bold bet on making audiences sit with a villain who can't be reasoned into changing, only stopped, contained, or outlasted. Once Marvel commits to building Doom as the next major threat, this isn't simply another escalation in raw power. It's a genuine evolution in what kind of villain this franchise is capable of telling stories about. Thanos was a threat the Avengers could eventually understand well enough to counter. A collapsing multiverse, paired with a villain who has no interior conflict left to exploit, is something this team hasn't actually had to face yet, and if the trailer's own framing is accurate, calm confidence instead of rage, certainty instead of struggle, that's precisely the temperament comics associate with Doom at his most dangerous. So, after all of this, does the MCU's Doctor Doom actually hit harder than Thanos? The honest answer isn't a clean yes or no, and pretending otherwise would be doing exactly the kind of lazy ranking video this topic doesn't deserve. At a pure baseline, stripped of prep time, technology, and magic, Thanos wins. He's physically and biologically superior, an eternal engineered for exactly this kind of durability, capable of matching the Hulk one-on-one and holding his own against multiple Avengers simultaneously, even before a single Infinity Stone enters the picture. Doom, underneath the armor, is a brilliant, but ultimately mortal, human being. Comics have shown this plainly. Catch Doom without preparation, without his enhancements active, and he genuinely struggles. But give Doom time to prepare, and the comparison stops being close. His real weapon was never his fists, it's his mind, an obsessive, restless intelligence that refuses to ever consider a problem finished. Thanos was a warrior first, someone who fought his way through problems. Doom is a planner, a manipulator, an inventor, and a sorcerer all at once, someone who fights his way around problems long before the fighting actually starts. And this franchise has established a consistent internal rule. Over and over, intelligence tends to outlast brute strength. Combine that mind with a mastery of both technology and magic simultaneously, something this universe has genuinely never given one character before, and you get an advantage Thanos structurally can't answer. Because comics have hinted more than once that magic itself may be one of Thanos' actual blind spots. There's one honest complication worth including here. Instead of ignoring for the sake of a clean ending, give Thanos the completed Infinity Gauntlet, and the math shifts hard back in his favor. That version of Thanos erased half of all existence with a single gesture, and even in his God Emperor state, Doom has been shown struggling against a Thanos operating at full gauntlet power in the comics. So the honest version of this conclusion isn't Doom beats Thanos, full stop. It's this: stripped down, Thanos is stronger. Given room to prepare, Doom becomes the more dangerous of the two by a wide margin, right up until Thanos gets access to power that isn't fully his own to begin with, at which point the entire equation resets. Power in this universe has always run on one real rule: context decides everything, and that rule hasn't changed here either. What has changed is the shape of the threat waiting on the other side of it. Thanos needed an external power source to reach true godhood, and everything he became was borrowed, however completely he wielded it, from stones he had to hunt down one at a time, each guarded, each costing him something to obtain. Doom's danger was never rented from anywhere else. It's native to who he already is: patient, self-contained, and completely convinced there was never anything to question in the first place. Take away Thanos' stones, and you're left with a very dangerous being who's still fundamentally playing by the same rules everyone else does. Take away Doom's armor, his lab, even his magic, and you're still left with a mind that's already decided the outcome before the fight begins. That's a much harder kind of threat to plan around, because there's no single artifact to secure, no gauntlet to keep out of reach. The danger is the person, not the equipment. If Marvel Studios really is building toward the version of this character comics eventually turned into a literal god ruling over the wreckage of reality, then Thanos was never actually the end of anything. He was the opening chapter, the villain who taught this franchise what loss actually costs, and what it takes to grieve something that can't be undone. Doom isn't shaping up to be the next chapter in that same story. He's shaping up to be the reason there might not be a way back to the story you knew at all. So maybe that's the real reframe worth sitting with. Beating Thanos meant undoing what he did and getting the old world back, snapping fingers a second time and watching everyone return exactly as they were. If Doom's endgame really is closer to rewriting reality itself rather than simply damaging it, defeating him in the traditional sense might not even be the actual goal anymore, because there might not be an original version of anything left to restore once he's finished. Surviving whatever he decides to become, and figuring out what's actually worth salvaging from whatever he leaves behind, might be the only win still on the table. Which side of that comparison do you think actually holds up once Secret Wars gets here, the raw force of Thanos, or the calculated certainty of Doom? Subscribe